This museum's a really special place. And with what Bob and Amy and the entire crew here are doing, you can sort of see it around you, is constantly relating what is Waltham today to what Waltham has been. And there are very few museums that have that kind of mission sort of embedded in what they are, right? And so, you know, many of you know me from my bookstore on Moody Street. I'll say at the beginning, so that it's a point of emphasis, that places like this need support, and you should support them, and you should become members, or if you can't afford a membership, just share your knowledge of it, because from the outside it may be a little difficult to find, but once you come in here, like, what an absolute sort of wonderment of all of Waltham in one spot. So my goal tonight is going to be to try to relate, do the same sort of thing, and Amy, thank you for such a gracious introduction, to relate what then to now. And I thought a lot about how to do this. Often when I speak, I'll just talk, but retelling this story is really a little bit of a challenge. And I thought instead what I would do is share with you the images that I encounter that make up the fabric of how you begin to see what becomes a story like this, and at the same time share what I wrote, because every time I went to try to retell it, I was confronted by the simple fact that I started writing this piece that was then published later in Lapham's Quarterly last year, 4 or 5 years ago. And it took that long to write. I went through a gazillion iterations, and it took, though I don't think they're here tonight, it took 3 of the town's sort of leading historians to help me figure a lot of this out. And I kept looking, thinking, I probably am not going to do a better job of telling this than what I've come up with. But what I can share is what is often right in front of our eyes, but then we kind of just wander right past, and that's what makes Waltham such a fascinating, wonderful place. So many of you have seen me out since I had my store walking, and as people have said, well, I see you out walking all the time, and often when I'm walking, I'm seeing these things and trying to relate them together. So if you'll indulge me, what I'd like to do is I'm going to read for about a half an hour, maybe a little bit less, from this essay that I wrote, and then I'm going to relate it to what I think it can mean for us today, and then I'd like to leave ample time for questions or comments or things that this can't fully address. So with that, I've had a fun romp back through, after a year of not looking at things, through the Waltham Historical Society and Library archives, and what I'll do at a couple of points here is just stop and talk about the slides that I pulled up. So reshuffle some things in. So the essay that I wrote is called Sight Unseen, a neighborhood along the Underground Railroad. As long as it has existed, Waltham, Massachusetts has been a place where outsiders quietly come and go. Bisected by the Great Road, which is Main Street, it was once one of few stops on the journey west from Boston to the Massachusetts frontier. 9 miles out from the city along a series of wooded brooks that roll into the slow current and wide turns of the Charles River. When I moved here 15 years ago, people called folks like me a breezer, which many of you are probably familiar with. Anyone who is not from here must just be breezing through, heading somewhere else as if Waltham were still a village way station. I found this photo last week. It's actually from a little bit further on the north side, but I believe that that's about 100 and God knows how many years ago, right along the way of Lexington Street up in North Waltham. But I think it's a very good visual representation of what Main Street into the Waltham Plain would have looked like in the 1700s. People used to do cattle runs right through, right outside this window, and it was pretty wide open and pretty depopulated. In the center of town, there is a little hill traversed by a street named Mount Pleasant, and I live at the top. At the foot is a house with pale blue wooden shingle siding vaulted on a high stone foundation. Built around 1840, it was first occupied by a man named Samuel Locke, his wife Harriet, and their youngest son. At the other end of the lane, Mount Pleasant runs into a street called Liberty Street. A house surrounded by flowers and fruit trees once stood where Liberty opens onto the bustling Great Road, now called Main Street. A man named Jarvis Lewis lived there with his family while operating an apothecary shop out of the front room. In Locke's house, a long-forgotten pictorial monument hints at the past life at Liberty and Mount Pleasant. Breezers, who set down roots in the neighborhood, did something radical, sustained it for a generation as if it were routine business, and then went back about their lives without fanfare. On the walls of a modest third-floor loft, likely occupied by Locke's son, dozens of printed engravings from Harper's magazine form a kaleidoscopic collage depicting the daily triumphs and tragedies of the Civil War. Like the walls of a prehistoric cave, portraits, battles, and cartoons weave together, resonating with the overwhelming tale of conflict that surrounded the everyday events of these residents' lives. But the Waltham that Jarvis Lewis and Samuel Locke came to in the early 1840s was shaped a generation before their arrival by the merchant inventor Francis Cabot Lowell, of whom this is, I believe, still the only, is that correct? The only likeness, a silhouette of him. Lowell died young, and there's not much else of him there. Along with a close-knit group called the Boston Associates, Lowell had set off the American Industrial Revolution at a nearby mill along the river. Waltham was the first industrial center, but unlike the empire of rigidly managed compounds that spread along the more powerful rivers of New England after Lowell's death in 1817, it was not a company town. This is an early likeness of the building where we're sitting. With the opening of the mill in 1814, the town was transformed from a hamlet into a village with a vibrant social life. Mill-related associations, often initiated with non-mill townspeople, included a dance group and a speaker series. Even a lending library was created, an uncommon institution at the time. These are books, the catalog of books from what was called the Rumford Institute in Waltham, which was an early lending library in America. I did not know these existed till last week. And I have not sufficiently looked through to see what was in the catalog, but remember this name right there, Josiah Hastings. With more people in Waltham and a religious revival sweeping the nation at that point, the First Parish Church took a special place in town life. At the heart of it were the sermons, a source of entertainment and an exercise of authority. They had the power to both break and mend the community. In one 1812 sermon, the town minister, Samuel Ripley, delivered a screed in opposition to the impending War of 1812 with the British. The immediate consequence of his foray into politics was the loss of 55 parishioners, who stormed across the road and formed the Second Religious Society, and it was a rift that was never fully resolved because you all know these churches around the corner. A hard man. Ripley was a hard man. He did everything that he could to eke out a living on a very small salary with increasingly diverse parishioners and unprecedented demands. At the same time, he had to tend to a struggling extended family. In 1811, his half-brother William died of tuberculosis. Half the population of Boston had tuberculosis at that point. At the apex of his career as minister of Boston's First Church, Ripley helped ensure that William's children did not starve, and one nephew was sent to study law with Daniel Webster, who later became senator. Another helped teach at the church school in Waltham and gave his ordination sermons at his uncle's pulpit. And after delivering those sermons in 1826, the nephew, a young Ralph Waldo Emerson, boarded a coach to Boston, and a fellow traveler getting on the coach with him said, "You will never preach a better sermon than that." By the 1830s, a conventional town center began to take shape along the Great Road. This is an 1830 map. It's probably very faint, but there are little dots throughout it, and they're basically the only structures that exist. There's almost nothing here still, even though there's thousands of people, maybe 10,000 versus 1,000 30 years before. A man named S.B. Emmons arrived and started a newspaper called The Hive, and he had it printed first in Boston and then later at a local print shop. Opened along the Great Road by another recent newcomer named Josiah Hastings, who had printed, if I go back, those. Hastings Road, or Ave, yeah. In a company town, Emmons and Hastings would have had a hard time with the company men if they ran an independent newspaper as they did. In Waltham, they printed what they liked, which mostly fit the taste of a somewhat conservative and pious townfolk. Aside from one small notice posted in many issues, little would have ruffled local feathers. That notice offered access to a library of anti-slavery volumes at Hastings Print Shop, come one, come all. The words anti-slavery and Massachusetts were far from synonymous in 1835. The Virginia slavery debates that set in motion the South's sort of ideological doubling down on the virtues of the institution had only recently occurred. And Massachusetts had outlawed the practice half a century earlier, yet most of the attitudes among many Yankees here range from indifference to tacit support. To that end, abolition was not openly or widely espoused in town at the time. The average Walthamite's interest in race was likely confined to such topics as the inferiority of the Irish, their plans to immigrate to the United States, and their plots to overthrow the country with support from the Pope. This is from my private library. Little book. Emmons shared such beliefs about the Irish, but his readers may not have shared his about abolition. His paper shut down in early 1836. At least one abolitionist was notably passionate, however, as shown by an article in another 1834 publication. This is not it. I've never found an adequate representation of the letter I'll read from. William Lloyd Garrison was publisher of the nation's leading anti-slavery newspaper. It had started a few years earlier, The Liberator, and had noted with some satisfaction the formation of a Waltham anti-slavery society that spring in 1834. With much of Boston opposed to abolition, a mob would try to kill Garrison for speaking there the next year. They hunted him down, they tried to hang him, they failed. I don't know how you fail hanging someone. He escaped. The mayor, who was actually Theodore Lyman of the Lyman estate here, had to beg on his knees because there were no police forces to get them to let him go. He jumped out a window and ran away. And it was the well-to-do citizens of Boston who went to hang him, and it was the poor citizens of Boston who saved him. So he had noted with satisfaction the creation of this society, and he noted it with satisfaction because it was hostile elsewhere around here. Meetings were held at a tavern along the Great Road, a little bit further down, sort of where the Coleman real estate insurance property is. This is a note from one of the discussions at church, one of the churches here, Reverend Bernard Whitman, who was sort of a firebrand minister here. At first glance, the notes of this society filed with the Liberator could fool someone into thinking that the group mostly cared about dues. In reality, they went much further in their opposition to slavery than simply passing a collection plate. In November, the Liberator ran the following letter. Dear Sir, supposing a slave makes his escape from his master and comes in Waltham, and I assist him in getting still further from his master so that he finally gets to Canada or anywhere else beyond his master's reach, can that master recover at law the amount of the slave from me, provided I am worth it? I.e., have I or have I not a lawful right to assist a runaway slave retain his freedom? An answer to this inquiry, either by letter directed to DMG of Waltham or in next week's Liberator, will be received with favor by a friend of all humanity. Dodging the pragmatic particularity of the question, Garrison acknowledged that the issue raised by the so-called Waltham correspondent was entirely novel and had, quote, never been submitted to any judge or jury in New England. I have never found out who DMG is. Many of us have been looking for DMG, no idea. A side note about this is that Waltham also was not always a progressive community, and I should add that note because it never made it into this piece. This is an advertisement from Jonathan Brewer. Many of you may know John Brewer's down the road. He fought in the Revolutionary War and was an esteemed citizen of Waltham, looking for a runaway slave that he owned in 1775. This is the death notice of a man named Felix Cuff in 1890. Cuff was a Revolutionary War soldier. He escaped to join the war to escape his master here, and was dragged back out of the army and sued for his pension at the end of the war. The description here is incredibly unsettling because it seems very knowledgeable about the state in which he would have died. And while it says that he had a stomach problem and was found dead the next morning, the bruises about his head that he struggled a long time and was drawn together crooked suggests that some people in Waltham, as he was in his lifetime, probably did not welcome Felix Cuff. You can go back further in the baptismal records of the First Parish Church, 1755. The names Bartholomew, Dina, Lucy, and Prince are all there. Those are all names of slaves in Waltham. Around the time I moved in, at the top of Mount Pleasant, a new family moved into Samuel Locke's house at the foot of the hill. And we chatted from time to time about how so many residents had lived on the street for generations. Their house had been run as a boarding house for nuns for nearly a century. And it was a strange place, they told me. Odd things remained. They invited me to look at their third floor room. It was different, they said, and there were newspapers on the walls. Climbing staircases with high steps and low ceilings, I went inside, the beams and planks widening as I neared the loft. Gordons lashed back. Let's see, nope, that's a note, sorry. At the top of the stairs, a small window cast daylight across the room. Smokestack of the mill, rising up over Main Street. The engravings published in Harper's magazine during the Civil War that completely papered these walls had been meticulously cut and pasted. Those are all separate sheets. Sepia tones blended the prints together, ships at sea cascading into grand dances for elite officers of the Union Army, rolling out into the howling, sad hills of battlefields. War plans, charges, retreats. I had never seen or heard of anything like this. It's a multi-dimensional visual representation of America during the war. The walls seemed to move. The hundreds of thousands of finely etched lines pulling the tiny room up together to the ceiling as though it were immeasurably larger than it appears. It's a cartoon of a presentation to Jefferson Davis by a slave of a bomb. Nice. By the early 1840s, Lincoln with his cabin. By the early 1840s, Waltham had grown substantially. Newcomers were moving into the town center that had taken shape over the previous decade. They were the first industrial middle class in America, and they took up the mantle of innovation begun 3 decades earlier that we were surrounded by. They moved beyond the mill and went into business and government. That's the block. They joined local societies and sat in the same pews as mill folks and mill owners, and to accommodate their activity and hasten the ease of getting around, they built roads, Liberty Street. A row of stores was built across from the print shop where Hastings was, which would have been right about there. In 1843, a man named Lewis Smith constructed the suggestively named Liberty and Mount Pleasant Streets, passages to his large tract of land he steadily split up for houses and churches of various denominations. The Catholic Church used to be right over there. I learned to my surprise that Mount Pleasant streets are often so named in homage to the abolitionist town of Mount Pleasant, Ohio. In the early part of the 19th century, a newspaper was started there with support from the town's Quaker population, and they were among the earliest white Americans to protest slavery. They put their money where their mouths were. They were pious, vicious, intense people. Think of Melville's Nantucket whalers, those sorts of people. Many gave up their farms in the South, told all the slaveholders there to go to hell, headed north to states like Ohio. Their newspaper was broadcast to the outside world, and the town name became synonymous with abolition. Smith's housing development attracted people. This is the corner of Liberty Street cutting through to the school. Belonging to women and men alike, the neighbors' names rise up as hosts, participants, and authors in the anti-slavery literature of the time. A commingling of ministers, tradesmen, and politicians, among others. They led an increasingly public tide of organized opposition to slavery. They were comfortable abolitionists. Liberty, those are some of their houses after our actual erased. Sylvanus Cobb, and I should warn you about my language coming, but I'm also not going to edit the history of it. Sylvanus Cobb, the Universalist minister, began publishing the radical newspaper, the Christian Freeman and Family Visitor, out of Hastings print shop during that time. The incoming Unitarian minister was a mathematician named Thomas Hill, who later became the president of Harvard University. He published a collection of anti-slavery poems just prior to arriving at the pulpit in Waltham. Samuel May, uncle of the novelist Louisa May Alcott and president of the Anti-Slavery Society of Massachusetts, presided over protests and celebrations in town. Speakers of national renown visited with increasing frequency. Letters sent to Cobb, recounted in his son's 1867 memoir, reflect the more common beliefs of the rest of the nation regarding abolition in the early 1840s. Quote, "Dear sir, when I subscribed for your paper, I supposed I was going to have a real good Universalist paper, as I knew that you were one of the best preachers in the country. But I find that I was sadly mistaken. I cannot stand your stuff about niggers, so you may stop my paper. I have paid up to next May, but you may send the rest of the papers that it should get to someone that loves niggers better than does yours truly." In 1842, the matter of harboring escaped slaves, raised in part by the Waltham correspondent a decade earlier who had written to Garrison, now hit the state with thunderous effect. A runaway slave named George Latimer had made his way to Boston, where he was arrested for larceny and ordered held. Fearing that Latimer would be returned to the South, his attorney, Samuel Sewell, appealed for a jury trial where he expected that Latimer would go free. But when the case was heard by the Chief Justice of the Mass Supreme Court, Lemuel Shaw, who was ardently opposed to slavery, Shaw shocked the state by ruling that Latimer's fate was a matter of federal law, and Latimer could be sent back. Protests erupted, and the tide of opposition to slavery was growing nationwide. A gathering was called at the Methodist Church in Waltham in order to, quote, "take into consideration the encroachment of slavery on our laws and liberties, and to take measures that we in Massachusetts may be rid of it." Ripley presided over an audience of almost 500 people who signed an anti-slavery petition demanding that Latimer's release. Garrison later noted, "Waltham had a stirring meeting and is doing well." Such action was not without its risks, especially for Ripley. The mill owners had an interest in ensuring a steady flow of cotton to the north, which meant that they had an interest in slavery. Most owners attended Unitarian churches like Ripley's, and they were not pleased with abolitionist activity taking place in their own backyard. They were known to exert tremendous pressure on abolitionist ministers. During a later fugitive slave crisis, Garrison wryly remarked that it was more common to expect the bell of Waltham's Unitarian church, quote, being clogged with cotton and would not sound. This is a notice from during the Latimer affair. These people also were sort of hilarious. So you look at the bottom, and they decided not to host this event at the place where they initially supposed, because the only tavern in town was a rum tavern, which means they wanted more to drink. Reverend Bowers from Concord was there. One of his descendants is here tonight. who's a leading figure in this. Though the cotton men had spread their networks across the nation, the abolitionists living alongside them at Waltham were able to act independent of their wishes. Unlike the brethren in company towns, Waltham's tradesmen and their families held comfortable and secure roles in most city institutions. They led the board of the local bank. They pushed to bring the railroad through town. They bought and sold and developed the city center. And they were more piously technocratic than peacenik. This business class transformed Waltham. Their work laid the foundation for the town's purchase of a massive tract of land across the river, doubling the size of the village center. And that purchase led to the arrival of the Waltham watch factory, which made the first mass-produced watch. It was the iPhone of its day, and it was responsible for mechanizing the movements of the Union Army during the Civil War. In the wake of the Latimer affair, the Waltham abolitionists rallied. Frederick Douglass delivered an address there in 1844, here in 1844. August 1st celebrations, the first significant nationwide gatherings to ritualize in opposition to slavery, drew thousands to a grove along the river down near Brandeis. In August 1845, Emerson returned to deliver an anti-slavery talk, his first outside of his hometown in Concord. He was incredibly reluctant to do this, partly because one of his best friends was Francis Cabot Lowell's son. I love this, possibly the favorite thing I ever found in all of this, which announces Charles Lennox Raymond and Frederick Douglass coming to speak here, but the idea that old school was even something you could say back then. That's great. Emerson singled out the mill owners, exhorting the audience to see the persistence of slavery not just in southern plantations, but also in the actions of the Boston associates who founded this place, whose businesses encouraged the slave system with insatiable demands for raw cotton. Support for slavery, he said, quote, acts in certain places. It acts on the seaboard and in the great thoroughfares where the northern merchant or manufacturer exchanges hospitalities with the southern planter or trades with him and loves to exculpate himself from all the sympathy with those turbulent abolitionists. A relative of Sylvanus Cobb's, Locke came to Waltham in the 1840s. To give you a sense of how intense this was not just rallies. One of the leading abolitionists in town ran the post office, though I'm not sure they knew at the time that he was the one running it. But during these escaped slave instances, this is not Frederick Douglass, this was Senator Douglass, and they literally hung an effigy of him in town from a tree, which is a pretty serious message. A relative of Sylvanus Cobb's, Locke, came to Waltham in the 1840s, moved in at Mount Pleasant, married, and had a son named Alonzo. And I searched for the town archives for Samuel, but I only found a few facts about him. He was a religious man. He hosted the ratification of what were called the Articles of Faith and Covenant for the Universalist Society here in his parlor, and later served on the first board of directors for the town library. On the day that Waltham acquired the land across the river for the watch factory, he wrote a vigorous endorsement in the town newspaper for cod liver oil. And there's mention of his job. He was a technocratic sort of person. He headed up the city's newly built gas works. Born in 1847, Alonzo came of age as the nation, including his neighborhood, went to war. He was always in poor health. He nevertheless attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and then returned to Waltham, where he became a respected mechanic and led the local Masonic lodge. At the end of the war, Alonzo would have been around 17, so I looked to see if he had joined the Union Army, and instead I found a small folder of papers covered with a handwritten note about a man whose name I vaguely recognized from the documents I read, Dr. Jarvis Lewis. A doctor only in the parlance of the time. Lewis was more of a druggist, and he had built his house at the corner of Liberty Street across from Hastings Print Shop. This was not his house. Shockers. He was a leading abolitionist. He had led the drafting and signing of Waltham's petition for the Latimer affair, alongside Reverend Ripley, and he and his wife were occasional contributors to the Liberator. She would send poems in. And they clearly knew William Lloyd Garrison. Samuel May, the head of the Anti-Slavery Society, presided over their wedding. Collected by a town historian, the note that I found was written in the early 1900s by Lewis's daughter, Helen, and it describes their home. A little girl in the 1840s, she would have known her neighbor, Alonzo Locke. And the historian prefaced the note with a comment that Helen wore attire from the Civil War her entire life. First, she described the yard, and then the entire house, room by room, in there. You can see the cases. They would have lived behind it, the cases for the drugs and the counter. And the... Quote, "It was said that Liberty Street was so named because Mr. Lewis Smith and Dr. Lewis were such strong abolitionists. The house was one of the stations on what was called the Underground Railroad, a plan for helping runaway slaves to escape. They were sent out of Boston, hidden in the backs of carriages, and left at the houses known to the initiated, to be kept out of sight in the daytime and sent on to Concord by night, on their way to Canada where they were safe. And at one time, a colored family was here for a few days. At another time, Dr. Lewis was at an anti-slavery meeting in Boston, and before his return in the evening, a colored man came to the back door saying that he had been sent here. He was let in, rather fearfully, by the women folks, but it proved all right. There were other cases not so well remembered. The work was attended by the risk of fine or imprisonment, but fortunately the house was never searched by slave owners or their agents, and the owner was never arrested, though an active worker in the cause. Armed with photographs of the walls of Locke's house, I sought an expert who could help me make some sense of this world that surrounded the room at Mount Pleasant, and I was led to John Stauffer. Stauffer is a man who should be photographed only in daguerreotype. He has hair like John Brown's, as though he runs his fingers through it, pulling it straight up without noticing. A leading expert on images from the Civil War, he invited me to his Harvard office to discuss Locke's third-floor room. Seated beneath a photograph of Frederick Douglass, he's the world's largest collector of Frederick Douglass images, Stauffer handed me a scrapbook, and with a gentle, raspy, and sing-song voice, he paused at a Harper's Magazine image to explain that Harper's was the cinematic powerhouse of imagery during the war. The magazine's importance in creating a uniform vision of immediate events across the entire nation was unprecedented. People saw war for the very first time. Its sway was such that a full spread of dead Union soldiers published in their pages horrified the public to the point it almost turned the North against the war. During Reconstruction, this is Captain Samuel Ryan from Waltham, who led a colored brigade during the Civil War, and was wounded. During Reconstruction, emancipated slaves papered simple rural homes in the South with newspaper images from the war. Memory on the walls. But the room at Mount Pleasant did not look the same as those rooms. Stauffer could think of nothing like it ever found in the North. "It's sweet," he said, and I got the sense that he meant it in the saddest and most expansive sense of that word. I asked him about the Underground Railroad, mentioning Helen Lewis's account, but Stauffer said it was a fad in the early 1900s to say your family had harbored runaways. And then he closely read Helen's note and seemed to think twice. Quietly and calmly, he said, "That seems much more authentic." Alonzo Locke was around 13 when the war began. Stauffer and I visited the room at Mount Pleasant together, and as we stood there, it seemed most likely that it was Alonzo's handiwork, a boy's imagination reflected through the pages of popular culture and pinned up just as children memorialize the wins of athletes on the walls today. I pointed Stauffer to an image of Nathaniel Banks, Waltham's now forgotten favorite son. Unlike other politicians of his day, Banks was not from the elite. He worked at the Waltham Mill, and his school debts were wiped clean by his teacher, the Reverend Ripley. Nathaniel Banks, in uniform on the wall of Locke's house, is notable because Banks today is seen as a political opportunist. He was the first Republican Speaker of the House. He was then governor of Massachusetts. During the war, he was exiled to manage the Union's occupation of New Orleans after he forfeited the Army's entire commissaries to Stonewall Jackson in a humiliating rout. And it is said that Mary Todd Lincoln distrusted him and kept him from serving in Lincoln's cabinet. Here, none of that is visible. Alonzo has placed an engraving of Banks in full uniform, his regal hometown hero among the pantheon of mythic figures and events in the war. The most famous images of the Civil War are here, including the searing July 4th, 1863 engraving of the lashback of Gordon, quote, a typical Negro. Crouched in front of the wall, Stauffer stopped at a sea battle scene where someone, perhaps Alonzo, had colored the explosions that light up the sky. Nearby, next to the tall, thin visage of the unfortunate Mexican Emperor Maximilian, is a cartoon about a little boy drowning. Every image is neatly cut, fitted, pasted. Back on Mount Pleasant Street, I asked Stauffer if he knew of Henry Warren, and he lit up. Warren was the last man to photograph Abraham Lincoln 2 days after the second inaugural address. I told him that Warren's studio was right below us on Main Street, a block from Jarvis Lewis and the Locks, alongside the dry goods store of Newell Sherman, another of the town's ardent abolitionists. I added that there's a particular Warren photograph I love more than all the others I've seen. A group of people stand in front of Hastings' print shop. I imagine one of them is Hastings himself. The road is laid out before them, 2 houses perfectly appointed, white with picket fence. The caption says, printing office and residence of Josiah Hastings, Waltham, Mass. And it is a typical image, plain and simple, common. It could be anyone, anywhere, pausing for a photograph and moving along. The ordinariness of it is its theme. Regular, working, middle-class tradesmen doing what they do, unimpeded and anonymous, among countless similar photographs of the day. On any given day in that neighborhood during the mid-1800s, you could stop at the print shop for a paper, get your groceries at Mr. Sherman's, have your portrait taken by Mr. Warren, pick up your medicine from Dr. Lewis, and go to the church with Mr. Locke. A comfortable life among comfortable people, some of them from here, most of them not. Every one of them going about their routines, nobody in a hurry, no danger that someone is just passing through, not even worth a second thought, nothing extraordinary to see here. So I think about this a lot, and I think about relating what all of this means since I live around it all the time, and this is much of Waltham history, so the history of any place. What does it mean when you live in a community? And I've tried to sum up what that means around the word radicalism, but then today I was thinking, well, probably stop for a moment and describe what I think of as radicalism. And I think that the elements that I mean when I say radicalism, because people have different senses of it, are keeping things small and community-based, broad-based individual and collective liberties and responsibilities that align with peace and justice and human rights. And probably most importantly, that no institution that works against those values is so special or sacrosanct that I wouldn't change it or get rid of it to preserve those rights. And that's definitely a radicalism. And so I tried to compare what I thought about these people and why I'm so struck by this notion of them as a sight unseen, as people right before our eyes doing this humble thing. rather than claiming that they were the great saviors of all black people from the Civil War and earlier. And I thought about what they faced. They faced an impending crisis of democracy, slaves fleeing in every direction. Parties were collapsing, all of the political parties in the country. Nationally powerful local industries were paying for it, and local civic institutions were involved too. They were privileged and white, and there were dangers for them anyway, despite their privilege. But they were acting on a belief that the world was in peril, and I think that religious belief at the time cannot be underestimated. They believed that God was going to show up any minute and end this because we were living in sin for having slavery. What did they do? They fought for democracy against an impending crisis. They organized and harbored slaves. They didn't care about parties. They called out the industries that were fueling this and fought their influence in town. They took over civic institutions or made new ones when the ones that existed were complicit. They knew their humble place within a larger movement and had a sense of their privilege and whiteness. They accepted the dangers that they faced and continued living good lives. And they were uncompromising in their belief that the things that were dangers were threatening the world. So what about today? What I take from this is that if there's a crisis of democracy, good historical precedent, fight for it. Immigrants are fleeing now instead of slaves. Organize, harbor, and protect them. The parties are collapsing. I may be a minority in this, I don't care. Nationally powerful local industries are fueling it. Many of them are industries that have relationships to Waltham. Call them out for it and fight their influence. Some local civic institutions are too. That is true today. Take them over and make new ones. We are privileged and still largely white in this community, and we can still know our humble place within larger movements. There are dangers for us, I'm sure, some, and we can accept that and continue to lead good lives. And we should act more like we believe the world is in peril and be uncompromising in our fight. And I think all of this presupposes what the sort of Stoneman Douglas students are saying the last few weeks, is none of this is possible unless you actually do something. So with that, I'd be happy to take any of your questions. And actually, I should say before I do, people to thank. The four historians in town, who I just could not have navigated this without them. Jack Cox, who teaches history of Waltham at the high school, Marie Daly, Angie Emberley. Marie knows everything about the north side of Waltham and a lot about Irish history in Waltham. Angie Emberley, who used to run the Historical Commission, Mort Isaacson, who runs it today. The library we have is amazing. Go sit in the Waltham room and just ask for random things sometime. The Historical Society, many of these photos come from William McCarthy, the Historical Society, who always seems to have one of these at hand, and the museum for housing this discussion. If you want to know more about these homes, Mort, who is truly a rocket scientist, was an engineering professor at BU for years. In his spare time, has researched every one of these homes through the neighborhood and has books on the history of homes in Waltham, many of which are still here, and tell these stories in their own different ways. So, thank you.
You got some questions. We'll start with there. We have a room mic if you want, so that everybody can hear your questions.
Let's do that.
In the last photograph you showed us.
Yeah.
Can you go back to that? Those
Sure,
houses?
by all means.
Where is that? The corner of Hastings Street there? What is
I
that?
think that
It's like hard to
I know, right?
decipher because
So they modified the house a lot too, but I think it goes right there.
Yeah.
I think it goes right there.
So that
now.
is Main Street.
Yeah, that's Main Street, and so that's from the side where Warren's photography studio was. If any of you are driving down Main Street, so the Valvoline station around the corner, it's about a half a block down from there.
Okay.
And I think that's probably Hastings right in front of his own shop. They added on to the front of it, is what Mort said to me. So it's a substantially modified structure. But if you go down there and you take a look, It's there. You can sort of see the backbone of the structures.
Okay, all right, I'll look next time I go.
Yeah.
Also, the house on Liberty Street where all those things are on the wall,
Mm-hmm.
and those are from Harper's Weekly during the Civil War.
Yes.
So Winslow Homer was an engraver for Harper's Weekly during the Civil War. So, I mean, does the Museum of Fine Arts know about this?
No, and it's a terrific question because everybody has this sense of like, what do we do with this thing?
Because it's so, I know, it's so precious.
It's precious. John Stauffer had offered at some point to, if we would photograph it flat, he has a eidetic memory, I think. So he can name the date for every single one of those. If you just had a glass of wine and could sit all night. So he said that he could date how it came together if it was actually done chronologically. But to your question of like, do other people know about this? No, I've walked a very fine line with this. Our neighbors are heartfelt custodians of this room, and they know not to damage it. They found it by damaging it a little. You saw those white holes they were trying to put in insulation. They were like, maybe this is special. But they also want to be left alone. And I have decided to respect that. I used to do some archaeology work. I always walk that line between the group of outsiders who come in and tell you something is special versus you, it's theirs. And while I know that it is a national treasure, and it really is, I've left them alone.
Have they photographed it, like with really good photographs?
We have photographed the whole thing.
Okay, not just amateurs. So.
No, that's it. It could still use like a cave photographer, someone to do a flat photograph of every single surface.
Right, and just reassemble it.
They are open to that, to having maybe a National Geographic photographer, someone come in and kind of
That's
do
amazing.
that. So it's remarkable.
What's the microphone? Anybody else?
We got you, Bob, too. Alan.
Yeah, going back to your talk about the definition of radicalism.
Yeah.
And I'd like to point out that the word radical has the same root as root in the Latin. So perhaps radicalism is trying to get back to the roots of things.
I think so. I agree entirely. I think it is if you have a firm confidence in your rootedness in a place, then you don't need all of these things as they are to cling on to, and you can refashion them as they need to be for the people who live there, right? And I think there's a confidence, but that's why scale is such a huge component of it to me, and all these words have been just bastardized and repurposed in ways that are awful. So a lot of this is anarchism, right? But in the old school sense of anarchism, which just meant that like things that get too big often fail, so keep it small. Like there's just a limit to our control over many of these things. And then you read Dr. King or something, or you read Mahatma Gandhi, and they're saying the same thing. Like, don't start with national aspirations. Like, start around the block and get everybody together at the local church. And do, So yeah.
All politics is local.
That's correct.
Could you tell me the definition of a company town versus, you're talking about how Waltham citizens had freedom because they weren't in a company town, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
Really important question, yeah, So the way this is shaped, and at any point if I get this wrong, Amy is going to leap in front of me and tell it correctly. The Waltham Mill was, I think, remained the size that it did and never got much bigger than that. Again, really tell me if I'm wrong with this. The river's not as strong as in the places they went to look for to expand into. They tested it here and it worked as an idea. Like, okay, we can have an industrial mill in this country, but economy of scale, you want to get bigger. And so when they located what became Lowell and these other towns, those were big places, and often they were places where, now that they had some capital going, they could really fashion it how they wanted it to be. And what that meant was that when they brought in outside labor, the same as all these places do, which is a complex sort of, not all bad thing, right? Bring young women off of farms who otherwise may not have had a good outlook where they were, pay them wages, sort of a radical idea at the time, but those towns were very constrained in how they were run, and it was still run to run the factory first and foremost. And so a company town in the loose sense of it means a place where the store you shop for your goods at is not owned by Newell Sherman, it's owned by the company. Your wages, everything sort of feeds into that ecosystem. The church, there, if they don't like the minister, they'll replace the minister. They own the land where the leases are. In some regards, the watch factory was sort of a move in that direction, but it just didn't work. And you see that idea persist today. Facebook is busy trying to build a huge, I don't know how much money they'll have left, but a bazillion condos for their own employees in one area of East Palo Alto, right? So it's that idea that you basically live for the town. I live for the company, and this never quite had that setup here. It's very unusual. It's the underpinning of what makes Waltham an unusual place. So if you have a follow-up, sure, go for it. And then I'll come to you, Dee.
One of my ancestors was the Marlins, and they had the Marlin Mill up in Andover. And but I had a question. Oh gosh, I don't really want to say now. Just for to ask you. Oh, I know that they came. A lot of them came over from the places in England where they were doing milling and that. Was that the same as people who came over to Waltham? They were.
Waltham became a big destination. At the beginning, I believe most of the laborers were from New England farms. Is that correct?
Most of the laborers were from New England farms, and in fact, it was really in the 1850s that you begin to have Irish immigration. You have Canadians. There's depression, so fleeing the farms in Canada, coming down, and then new immigration.
Well, yes, and I think that's crucial. Is these ideas came from Europe. The goal here, right? This is all bound up in the War of 1812 and the sort of politics around that. But like shipping became very dangerous, right? All of our ships were getting knocked off, and I think we lose sight of this. Like the first major secessionist movement in this country was New England, which was under duress on shipping so badly from whaling and all these things being hit by the British that like we almost said, we're out of here. This country's not working for us. And so Paul Moody, who was the associate of Francis Scavallon, and Patrick Jackson, all the associates, they sort of went over and they took these ideas, right? And so they were existing there for a while. In reality, as best I understand it, it's not even really a British notion. It's a Scottish notion. It may have been the Brits applying it somewhat in Scotland, but that there was an idea that underpins that's important for how they were doing what they were doing, which was called the improvement system. And their belief was basically that they were going to solve the problem of these unruly Scottish Highlanders by moving them into towns and make them work for factories, and it coincided perfectly with industrialization and pacification, all these things. And so it seemed like a moralist movement. Like many of these things, good and bad, these are sort of left-wing, progressive, technical ideas of the time, right? And then they sort of grow. But I think that's why you often see skilled tradespeople come through. And the watch factory especially didn't want low-class labor as they saw it. So they were hiring a lot of people from overseas who were high-end manufacturer people, watchmakers and things like that. So, yeah. Dee.
Alex, two things. One, a comment. I was thinking about Winslow Homer myself, knowing that he lived in Belmont, where the Women's Club is there on Pleasant Street. I don't know at what age. I think he was fairly young when he lived there, and whether there was anyone who actually knew him here in Waltham. But when he was sent to by Harper's to document the Civil War for a couple of years, there's quite a lot of information about his experiences there in the war. But other than that, I wonder what nagging questions you have that a missing piece here or there that you still want to track down, and how that information might become available if it were more well known that these pieces are missing through people who might have lived here at the time, and now they have their grandparents or their great-grandparents' photos, and little pieces sometimes fall into place when you least expect it on eBay or something.
So Homer, I never came across anything that said that he was here, but there's a lot of records, which gets to the second point. I mean, what is known, there's so much, and I feel like we're at a time where we can search it better than ever. The tools of technology make this much easier research than ever before, but it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. I really stopped myself on this, and I went to a more, I think this is where I try to balance some sense of trying to be a historian. I'm not formally trained as a historian, and let the side of being a writer be more dominant, which is what question am I trying to answer for today? And the question that I'm trying to answer for today doesn't require me to settle certain facts, and I've become more and more tyrannical about that. I have a real resistance, even when I know numbers, to prove what I'm saying. I often won't put them in a piece of writing, because I think we've gotten to be a bunch of sort of know-it-alls in this culture about if I have the numbers, I have the facts, and there are these sort of ethereal things that matter more. There are massive archiving projects going on. I wouldn't be surprised if the one that yields the most about details on this is one where they're crowdsourcing people typing up all the cursive from all the Boston Public Library's Civil War collection, which is massive. And in there, I know they already have letters from Jarvis Lewis to Garrison and things like that. But if I did this I'll lose my mind. And so I sort of stopped at some point. What I can tell you is it definitively was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And the way I know it is sort of an absurd story from the 1850s, where the Liberator published a notice of a guy who was fleeing the South and trying to get to Canada, who boarded a train in Boston. And when they asked him for his fare, he didn't have the money, so they kicked him off. Here at Waltham, where Garrison mentions that the friends in Waltham picked him up right away, got him in the back of a carriage, and got him out to Concord. And so you know that there was some organized effort here. Now, when they got to Concord, all of the townspeople assembled, and the guy fessed up that he was actually from Boston and just didn't have the train fare. He wasn't escaping anything. And yeah, that is how we know definitively that there was some organized response here.
Well, I just also wanted just to recommend your article to people, because your writing is really beautiful, and having read it, I think people would gain a lot more if you actually read Alex's article.
It's very kind of you. Thank you.
Can you tell us the journal again?
Sure, it's called Lapham's Quarterly. It's L-A-P-H-A-M'. Lewis Lapham, and this is probably why they published it, was the longtime editor of Harper's Magazine through the 70s, 80s, 90s. And Lapham broke away because he wanted to focus on whatever his own. So this is their journal. So we picked it up. And I'll have something on another component of Waltham history maybe next month. So an entirely different subject.
Alex, first I wanted to say thank you. It was a wonderful talk. I especially want to thank you that after you came out here to go to college, you didn't become a breezer. To our benefit.
We're not all bad.
One question, so I know from reading myself on some of the abolitionists back in the 1800s that while they were admirable in their thoughts of freeing blacks from slavery, they still were not looking upon them as having an equal place in society.
Yeah.
Did you come across any writings of either any of the abolitionists in Waltham or associated with Waltham that related to the blacks and their way or how they foresaw them in relation to liberty in society or equal rights?
It's a terrific question. There's a bias in the history we have, right? There's always a bias in the history you find, but right, like what percentage of the people whose writing we have are ministers? Yeah.
And I know I'm doing a personalist now because, of course, we're looking back, and back then for someone to want full equal rights for an African American would have been unheard of almost.
The ministers wanted radical equality, right? The ministers had a sense of total equality, and that is what they were after. And anything short of that was sin. Their parishioners, hard to know, right? I think that the most committed people early on probably believed that in principle. But in practice, hard to know. There are signs that around this time that Waltham was at least open to that idea, and of course that's the story of Robert Roberts, who was Christopher Gore's butler. Gore died in 1827. Last thing he did basically was write the preface to Roberts' book. Roberts was his servant. Gore had his summer estate here, which is often called the sort of Monticello of the North, and Roberts was African American, lived on Beacon Hill, and it is the first best-selling book in American history by an African-American writer. It was called Robert's Rules for Butlering, and it was advice for butlers on how to keep a good house, and it has some mortifying stuff in it. You just can't keep milk. I hate to break it without a refrigerator. So he, and don't put mercury in your hair for shampoo. But Roberts, what strikes me about that is not that he wrote the book, but that it has Gore's like glowing endorsement, and Gore was governor of Massachusetts, and it really is sort of leading figure who is behind so much. I mean, even this like was an early investor, and like was a sort of radical progressive politician of the Revolutionary War, and so I think it wouldn't have been unheard of to the parishioners here to have had people like that in their community, but they also had people like Theodore Lyman, and the Lymans were slaveholders, and so how they reconciled that, I don't know. And they don't often talk about interactions with African Americans in person, right? I think of them, Thomas Hill, who was the president of Harvard, was really seen as sort of a crackpot in the best way, and believed in total radical equality, and was just very matter of fact about these things. But again, very hard. I don't know how these people had the friendships they did. He would hang out with Louis Agassiz, who believed that it was the scientist at Harvard who believed in this sort of medical, scientific, racist notion that blacks were lesser. So I don't know how all these people reconciled this, but probably the same difficult way we do today, in a not all true believers. So
I had a question in terms of gender and abolition, because, there were a lot of notable women abolitionists.
yeah.
And I was wondering how that translates to Waltham and abolitionism. Like, were there a lot of women who were involved in the movement, and were there any, like, notable women abolitionists in Waltham?
I think that, as with all religious movements in this country, it would be a tricky phrase to say, as with many, why don't we say many? The actions of women, noticed or unnoticed, the collective actions of women form a huge, like women's societies raising money for abolitionist activity. There was no money otherwise. The guys like to find the right non-rum tavern and talk a lot. The women raised money. They did a lot of work. There is evidence of that a little bit here and there. I'm still bothered by the lack of how much I've not found about that here, but I think the striking relationship there has always been, to me, the Lewises, and there it seemed like a truly egalitarian relation, like an equal relationship. Jarvis Lewis's wife died very young in the 1840s, but you sort of see that with Helen, right? You see that with the sort of, there's something in that story. And overall, of course, you know that women law, this was deferred. Like women's suffrage and women's rights were entirely deferred for this cause on the promise that it would be the next major cause, and it wasn't. And so it's tricky. Even their concerns form the fabric of how you could run a network like this, because you would have to, the only way you can keep people off the roads at night and stay unnoticed and sneak carts in and out off this main road down this little side street is if people aren't out at night. And the best way to enforce that is to have anti-drinking laws around, and women are your effective way of getting all of those passed, right? And so in every single turn, and that's why later, suffrage and prohibition go hand in hand. And so the tools and mechanisms of all of it bear the hallmarks of it. And the last thing I'll say is that very short, less than a generation later, First Parish Church had a radical progressive, I think the first female Unitarian minister at the pulpit in the country. So this was a community open to those things. Has always been a community that has had women in leadership positions ahead of elsewhere in the country.
This is just so enlightening. I think I heard it, let me know if this is correct, that there were slaves living in Waltham and slaveholders.
Yeah.
I found that really startling. Do we have a sense as to the population of slaves living in Waltham, and are there slave graves or other sort of markers?
It's an awful, difficult question to answer. It's a really, that's back to you, John, something that continues to bother me. There are better people at work at that than I am, and I can tell you some of what I've learned from them. Many of them work at the state archives. One is a state archaeologist, one is an archivist for the state, but who got his PhD at Brandeis, I think, this year. This story of Felix Cuff is sort of central to this, right? And Cuff after the story of his demanding his pension is something that was written up in the Globe a few years ago. They found letters about this. It involved the Continental Army. There were requests for basically, like, I think they needed as many bodies to fight in that war as possible. And so they read in the framing of it, they read like a standard grievance of like, hey, Felix is free, and Felix wanted to join, and now they stole Felix back up here and said that he was a slave. In actuality, this historian at the State Archive says that it's much more complex than that, and it looks like it was more a hit against the guy Garfield, who owned all of these slaves, who was the largest slaveholder in town, that was political between white folks and didn't really involve their concerns about black people at all, which I find really interesting. Either way, Cuff said that he was going to start what was called a colony of Maroons, a sort of synonym at the time, somewhere down here along the common. He worked at the area down here, right, that was a paper mill before it became the mill, and he worked for Boys, I think is the name of the guy who ran the mill, as an assistant for years after demanding his pension. But he never set up the colony of Maroons here, and I found them instead listed in next door in Weston to some degree, and there were about 10 or 15 people. The whole story of getting him back up here involved a shootout between the slaves, the freedmen and troops, and like Garfield's men. And it's a very salacious story, but it just may not be fully accurate, right? It may be a later telling. Earlier than that, I would say that John Adams wrote the Constitution for the state and wanted radical and total equality, right? But whether that happened right away or not is sort of tricky to find. So in those years after, I don't think it would have been great to be African American anywhere here. And Cuff is sort of an example of that. The lives of them when they're not Christopher Gore's butler are very hard to know. Earlier on, they show up in these baptismal records. The Wellingtons and the Garfields owned slaves. The Lymans, I think, owned slaves. Historians have done some work to hide that. I will say that this, and this is not to besmirch a great town historian, but one of our great town historians who precedes me and is since deceased, she was remarkable and saved everything, but also a Wellington descendant, and poring over her records, which I have, and her papers, which I have, which gave me the baptismal records of the slaves and everything else. She did a good job in hiding the fact that the Wellingtons were slaveholders, because she didn't want it in her family, and but if you go back far enough, I think the most gruesome one is the Garfields were tough people. They were not good people, and there is a story of one of the Garfields killing one of the slaves in the fields that are now the Gore place. It's probably the 1730s, 1740s, and there's a story of one of the ministers here who was kidnapped by Native Americans during this huge, I don't know, taken all the way to Canada and back. I think he had a sort of slave servant. So we have, I would say a fully honest history that's consonant with the rest of this country here. So slaves' graves, it's not that I've found yet, so, which is terrible. So, other questions? I'll stick around if you have them. I'm really grateful to everybody for staying. Thank you so much.